It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Kiri Wagstaff. She's a leader in the Machine Learning and Instrument Autonomy group at JPL. Kiri has backgrounds that span computer science as well as more traditional domains of science that include planetary science and geology. She synthesizes those subjects and has invented techniques and algorithms that kind of have a hallmark of extracting a deeply buried signal from some complicated data set, images, time series data, sensor network data. And her work has included things on the Europa Clipper mission, algorithms to detect transient radio phenomena, analysis of Mars orbital images, and even predicting crop yields from Earth orbital images. So let's please welcome Kiri.
Thanks very much. Whoa, this is loud. I assume the microphone is working. Sounds like, okay, now we're more normal. All right, good morning. It's a pleasure to pick up the thread of our conversation here. We had a great introduction from Andrew and Sophia about exoplanets, technosignatures, and the search for those technosignatures. And George has given us an introduction to the kind of data that's out there and how we can start to tackle the challenges involved with very large data sets. So I'm going to now step in with a discussion and a high-level survey of some of the methods that are in use and that anyone can use. Any of you can apply to data that you may be collecting on anomaly detection. And because I wanted to pick one term for the title, I've used anomaly detection here, but you'll often hear it referred to as outlier detection or novelty detection. And to some people, these have slightly different meanings, but I would use them interchangeably in this discussion because they're all relevant. I'll try to stick with anomaly, but I will probably slip up and say outlier a few times because that's a very common one too. So we had some discussion already, but the first question, if you want to be able to detect anomalies, is to ask yourself, well, what is an anomaly? So how can I find what I'm looking for unless I first define it? I'm showing you here a sample of 10 galaxies observed by the Sloan Digital Sky Survey that George talked about earlier. And if you just contemplate these beautiful images, and I were then to ask you, which galaxy stands out to you as the most anomalous, what would you pick? This is the audience participation part of the talk, so if anyone has a thought about one that they think is anomalous, please raise your hand. Yes? Bottom right, okay. What's that? You don't have to be an astronomer to look at pretty pictures, right? So any other votes for other items that people? Bottom middle, okay.
I was going to say second one to the top is a weird linear.
So a very subtle, there's a kind of a black streak in the middle of this. Would you like to say why you picked this one? I'm guessing it would be because, I know it's him, but he's a little distracted. It's quite bright, perhaps. And this one, anyone want to say why did you pick this? The color difference? Okay. So
I'd also go for the second from the last because it's got these kind of cool spots in it which are missing.
these? Yeah.
Anomaly with respect to what?
Exactly.
If we are saying that is anomaly with respect to the other images, the bottom right is by far the weirdest one because it's blue than the other. But the point is with respect to what?
Yeah, so that is a great point here, that anomaly does not have an objective definition. It is always, you're anomalous with respect to what? And it's important not to leave out that half of the definition. What are you assuming is normal? So that you can then define what's abnormal. So that means that if I pick a different collection of 10 where I've retained the one in the bottom right, your answer to my question might change now. Anyone have a favorite anomaly here? Top middle, okay. Any others? What? I thought I heard something.
Bottom right.
Still bottom right, okay. And why this one? Why this one? Color, okay. I would argue also a challenge is that the longer you stare at this, the more you can make a case for almost any object, right? They're all individuals, so if you focus on how many objects are in the frame, if you focus on size, if you focus on color, shape, if one of those is very important to you, you'll make a different call here. So it's not straightforward to say, I'm looking for anomalies and there is a right answer. In fact, there are many answers, and the point is to be able to perhaps justify or explain what is anomalous about each object and what background it is coming from that defines it as anomalous. So in the context of technosignatures now, we have to ideally be able to say something about what we're looking for. And we had a great coverage of this already in terms of historically how they've been defined, some options and strategies depending on what type of data you're looking at and what assumptions you're making about other technologically advanced entities out there. I'm trying to not say civilization. So you can define a technosignature as a sign of technology that is not also a biosignature. And Jill Tarter had this additional phrase that qualifies it as something that modifies the environment in ways that are detectable. That's interesting because now a technosignature is not just a thing that happens, but has to also be something that we can detect. Now we are part of the definition. And this makes sense because if something happens so far away we can't detect it, it may as well not exist from our perspective, even if in some cosmic perspective it exists. One challenge with any of these searches for technosignatures, and this has already been alluded to, is that humans are already producing lots and lots of technosignatures. We had hints of this about the issues that come up in radio astronomy, and I'd like to show you an example of that, actually. Fast radio bursts have been mentioned a couple times already, but not in much detail. These are an interesting phenomenon that's been discovered within the last couple of decades. And I'm showing you here the very first and exciting one that was published in 2007 when a collection of researchers who were doing an archival survey of data collected by the Parkes telescope in Australia found this. Now what you're seeing here is the time domain on the x-axis and frequency on the y-axis. And signal strength is indicated by how dark these dots are. So what you're hearing here is something that starts at a high frequency and slides down over time, effectively, even though this is not at frequencies that the human ear can hear. This is why we have telescopes. This signal is so strong, and its properties, that particular curved shape of it over time, indicate that it has to come from somewhere outside our own galaxy, which is surprising because of its strength. So this is an enormous signal from very far away. And when it was found, we looked at this and could not explain why or how it was produced. So once you find one example, the hunt is then on to find more of them, right? And so in the ensuing decades, people have conducted searches. Breakthrough Listen's been a big part of this in searching for more of these fast radio bursts. And by the way, they're called fast because this one is actually relatively wide, but often they can only have a millisecond duration. And so this is one reason we're only discovering them now, is because we now have the capability to have very, very, very high fine time resolution in these radio data that we're collecting. So hunt is on for more of these. To date, perhaps 20 have been found, not a whole lot. We're looking for more. There's a whole story there that I don't have time for in this talk. But I will say that as part of this search, I was a member of a team called VFaster, which uses data from the VLBA, the Very Long Baseline Array, radio telescope to look for similar pulses. And we just have this running all the time, constantly. And I'll show you an interesting one that was found by the system, which we call a V-chirp, because it goes down and then comes back up. And we don't think this is a fast radio burst in the same astrophysical sense. But what is it? We actually still don't know, unfortunately. All we can do is observe these weird things that are in the data and then try to explain them. Now, what? Oh, the black line is missing data here. So that happens sometimes. Certain frequency channels might be unavailable. And that jumps out as potentially anomalous, too, to the human eye. In this case, we're ignoring it in terms of the strong signal strength. And I should say, actually, these are reversed. So here, signal strength is dark. Here, it is bright. These are two different publications, so they use different scales. The point here is, though, that we're pretty sure the V-chirp is something caused by human activity, something local. It doesn't look like things that originate from like a microwave oven or other well-understood sources of radio interference. We think it could be some kind of signal coming from a satellite that was flying overhead at the time this happened. However, the VLBA is spread out over like a third of the globe. And we leverage that fact to discard signals that are only observed by one station, something local. And this passed that filter. It was observed by 4 or 5 of the 9 telescopes that were in use. So it would have to be something far enough away that all of those had it within the field of view, which is a little odd. So that's why we still don't have an explanation for that one. And this is just one of many, many examples. Is it from a real, interesting, remote source, or is it just human pollution? And it's a chronic problem in the radio domain. Moving on, though, to a more general view of anomaly detection, I would broadly categorize anomalies into 2 categories you probably could already have guessed. One is that you can have an anomaly because something went wrong with your observation, or something got in the way, your data was corrupted, and therefore the observation looks strange for some reason. Or secondly, could be something that's truly scientifically interesting. This is the question with the V-chirp, which category does it actually fall into? And there's a tendency, I think, to prioritize the second category and say, we're looking for new science, we're looking for things of great interest to advance astrophysics or whatever domain. But I would argue these are both incredibly valuable because they both lead to potential improvements in science. So if you find an error, particularly a systematic one that happens often in the data set, you can use that to filter the data prior to analysis, or even go back and fix something upstream in your pipeline so that future data doesn't suffer from that problem. So that's useful for improving the quality of your data and therefore your ability to sift through and find things of scientific value. And of course, the ones on the right, those lead to the Nature paper, the big discovery, follow-up observations by other instruments when we're not sure what something is. And you can even revise theories in textbooks when we discover some new property. And this is kind of where we are with the fast radio bursts right now. We're on the verge of, what are these things? Can we explain them? Periodic ones have now been found. What does that mean? Are they all periodic? Are they not? We still don't know, and we're still trying to answer those questions. So to show you some examples of these 2 categories, in terms of errors, it could be that there's an artifact in the data itself, like here's one of those black vertical streak, like the one you saw earlier that was diagonal. That's just a problem in the data. Over here, something a little more interesting. If you remember George's plot showing that you take the sky image, but then you have to find all the sources within the sky image, right, to turn them into objects that you can study. That process is highly automated, and of course, it's not always perfect. So all of these galaxies should be centered within the frame that you're looking at, and it seems that this one is not. Almost certainly because this diffuse large galaxy is near this little tiny point of light, which I think our human eyes easily separate. But if you're just automatically processing the pixels, then those could, in this case, almost certainly were merged into a single object, and so it's centered on the space between them. That's problematic because then you're extracting properties such as color, size, shape, and other descriptors from this merged, blended object that doesn't really exist. So it will corrupt your further analysis if this remains within the data set. Those are just a couple of examples, things that happen in this data. Things that are scientifically interesting. We already talked about just with your eyes, you were able to pick out things of unusual color or shape or whatever. And those are exactly the kind of things that are often cited as being scientifically interesting. Shape, color. The green pea galaxies were mentioned briefly earlier. This was a new discovery that came out of the Sloan Digital Sky Survey data. These hadn't been observed previously. In terms of timing, I'm not showing you time data here. I'm going to let Matthew talk about time data analysis and focus on that. So I'm just looking at, say, images and objects. But pulsars are interesting because of their regularity and timing. Quasars are also objects at the nucleus of galaxies that are emitting radiation with an interesting time behavior as well. So those are some examples to give you an idea. Now I'd like to move on and talk about, okay, now we know what kinds of things might be out there. How do you actually find them? And this is an approach that employs methods from probability, statistics, machine learning, and there's a gamut of different methods that you can consider when analyzing a large data set. I, of course, don't have time to actually educate you about all of them, but I do have pointers at the end to some excellent surveys that are out there that walk you through these different methods. Something to keep in mind is that, of course, every method has to make some kind of assumptions about what's normal and therefore what's anomalous, just like we discussed. So you want to try to think about whether the method's assumptions fit what you know about the data that you're analyzing. so that you get sensible results. So I'm going to talk about 3 categories of anomaly detection methods that I have grouped into these 3 approaches. One is where you have some data, and for whatever reason, you can easily separate or distinguish certain events from the rest of the data. There are ways to do that. Secondly is when you really have a notion of what is normal, or you build a model from the data of what's normal, and then look for what falls outside of that class. And then third would be events that you just can't model for some reason. They're not amenable to the model you're applying, therefore they contain some kind of information or knowledge that is outside of what you're modeling. There is some overlap between these concepts, but these are 3 useful ways to approach the problem. So first, let's look at easily distinguished events. If you just use methods from statistics or probability, George alluded to this as well, where you make some assumptions such as data comes from a Gaussian distribution. That's what it was generated by. So anything that is a certain number of sigma away from the mean can be characterized as a statistical anomaly. You can also apply hypothesis tests that say, what is the likelihood that this object came from this generating distribution? And if you have, with high confidence, can reject that hypothesis, then you can say it's an anomaly. The weakness of this is exactly what's already been hinted at, which is you have to make an assumption. It doesn't have to be Gaussian, but you have to make some assumption about what the generating distribution was. And you may not know what that is. A way around this is to try multiple different options, of course, and then see what suits your data the best. If you don't want to make an assumption about what that generating distribution is, you can use empirical methods that simply look at distance between objects in the feature space. So these are things like k-nearest neighbor, where if you only have 2 dimensions, which would be great, but this is generally not true, 2 dimensions in your data, 2 features that represent each observation, then you can take a look at each point and compute the distance from it to every other point in the data set. And then, for example, in this case, count out what is its 5th nearest neighbor. 5 is a good number. How far is it from its 5th nearest neighbor? And if it's really far from its 5th neighbor, then it's probably an anomaly. And if it's close, then it probably isn't. So what you're seeing here is a run of an algorithm on synthetic data. The white circles were things that were determined that their 5th nearest neighbor was sufficiently close. And the black points, their 5th nearest neighbor was far enough away that they're considered anomalous. So the dashed red line is circling everything that falls into normality and then excludes everything outside of it. There are some drawbacks to this. K-nearest neighbor, first of all, you've got to compute distances to every other item in your data set, which is great when you only have 200 points, but not so great when you have 200 million objects or something like that. So it doesn't scale super well in a computational sense, although there are some geometric tricks to get around that. Secondly, we know that distance in very high dimensions, it's great in 2 dimensions. If you've got 200 dimensions, there's this thing called the curse of dimensionality, which makes it sound very evil. It's not necessarily evil. It's just a fact of life that as you have more dimensions, things tend to spread out, and differences in distances become less and less meaningful because everything is far away from everything else at some level. So you may not get good discriminability, and you can't even visualize 200 dimensions to check whether it makes intuitive sense to you as a human. So that can be challenging too. But this does work if you have the computational ability and the resources to apply it. If you want to not look at strictly distance, but instead density, so our intuitive sense that there's a lot of clumping together, that's a very dense region, where this is a very sparse region, things are very spread out. You can look at something called local outlier factor, which counts the number of points within a given radius of the object you're checking compared to the density of objects for each of its neighbors. So if it's in a locally sparse region of your feature space, it will be highlighted as an outlier. Interestingly, for this synthetic data set, both of these algorithms basically get the same answer. You can see these are rather similar red outlines, and the same objects are characterized as outliers in both cases. That doesn't always happen, but for this simple example, that is true. I will note as well that this is where clustering would fall in. It's a distance-based approach to organizing your data within feature space, and you can then find dense and sparsely populated areas as well. people often use, since in clustering everything gets assigned to something, people often use the distance between a point and its assigned cluster's center or median as a proxy for its outlier score. So that would be another way to approach this in a distance sense. But the same caveats I mentioned before apply also for clustering. If you're just working with distances, if you have a lot of dimensions or a very large data set, this may not work very well. But let's look at our same galaxy data set if I just apply the local outlier factor algorithm to this data set. And these are the top 10 outliers that were pulled out in this particular case across the entire data set. And it's interesting to look at them. Remember, each one's being picked for being in a locally sparse region of feature space, which in this case is just the pixels and their colors that you see in front of you. So I think to my eye, I might end up thinking, oh, well, these three at least look kind of similar to me, but they are very different in orientation, even though their shape is similar. And they have different accompanying objects nearby. So that means that their representation in this color pixel space may look quite different. I think humans are very good at learning what to ignore, for example, which is all being preserved in this feature space. If I were to characterize what it has found as anomalous, I would say it's found a lot of elongated galaxies or elliptical ones. And if you stare at it for a while, definitely all of these seem to have multiple objects with multiple different colors, so a lot of heterogeneity within the frame, which doesn't necessarily correspond to the central object itself, as I just mentioned. But that's what it's keying off of as being unusual. Because how often are you likely to see this in an exact same place for some other galaxy? Probably not. OK, one other approach to finding easily distinguished events is something called the isolation forest. And I'm actually curious, how many people have heard of the isolation forest? So a few people. How about decision tree? Oh, wow, almost everybody. That's fantastic. So if you know what a decision tree is, you are already like 90% of the way there. So a decision tree builds a model of the data by specifying tests at each node of this tree that allow you to sort the data into categories. So it picks a feature within the data set and a threshold, and if the object's value is less than v, it goes to the left, and if it's larger, it goes to the right. And it keeps breaking it down finer and finer and finer until things that are very similar are all together in a leaf of that tree. And things that are different are ideally sorted into different leaves of the tree. Now, there are reasons why you get much better results when you build a bunch of these. So this is where we get to a forest of decision trees, because they all can make slightly different decisions and then vote. And that's much more robust than building one tree and relying on it. The other difference here is that these are actually random decision trees, and the word random seems like weird and unmotivated, except what's going on is that introduces diversity into each of these trees. So in this case, for the isolation forest, you're going to randomly pick a feature and a value, and then split, and then randomly pick another one. So each tree is going to be really different from the other one. However, anything that has an extreme value will be pushed off to one side or the other of those splits. And the key behind the isolation forest is to look for how quickly does an object get split off into its own leaf. So things that are very, very, very extreme will go there. And one way this is quite different from what we saw with k-nearest neighbor or local outlier factor is those were looking at all features at the same time with the same importance. So you're computing distance between objects using all the features at the same time. Because the random forest is only using one feature at a time, you might make a decision and split this off and then stop. You don't even go any further because only one object ended up there. And it was isolated by a single decision, a single feature. That would be a really strong outlier. And what that means is that in your feature space, even with only two features, you get these very hyper-rectangle kind of linear decision boundaries instead of the nice circular ones that we saw before. And I shouldn't say nice because this is not a judgment. But you can see the shape is really different. This is the exact same data set, yet the model of normality that gets learned is influenced by the fact that we're splitting on individual features at each stage. And you can see what happens when you have two clusters. It's defining these star-shaped or cross-shaped decision boundaries within feature space. Again, if your features are such that it makes a lot of sense to say, I can make a decision based on only one feature, if it's really, really large or it's very, very dim or something like that, this is a great approach for that. I applied this to the same data set, and here's what we find. A bunch of, these are, again, the top 10 outliers within the data set that were identified, and they're very different than what we saw before. I would argue what we're seeing is a lot of bright and diffuse, and I don't know what that is, but it's very, very blue, right? But also bright objects that often have a single primary color. So again, that argues for you're able to quickly split it out because the values are so extremely bright in this case from the rest of the data set. All right, moving on to our second category of approaches. This is where you actually build a model of normality within the data set. So that requires that you have either a curated collection of normal observations that you've already vetted, or you have some notion of what fraction of contamination from anomalies are present. So you have to be able to specify that. A very, very common example of this kind of approach is something called the one-class SVM, or support vector machine. Who's heard of that? Quite a few of you. Excellent. So a support vector machine is just a machine learning classifier that tries to split data into two classes, A and B, plus and minus. But the one-class SVM is a tweak to that where you say, I only have one class, but build a model that encloses that class as tightly as possible. So in this case, it's modeling these tightly clustered guys and excluding the others, only because I was able to tell it, or specify to it, that in this case, 25% of the data is outliers. If you specify a different fraction, you will, of course, get a different answer. And so how much prior knowledge do you have about the fraction of anomalies within the data set? You have to build that in to be able to do this. In this case, I went back to the Sloan Digital Sky Survey galaxies, and I said I want to say there's 1% anomalies within this data set, and here are the top 10 that you get, which again are different from the ones that the other algorithms picked. I would say these are a lot of small, more dim and variable shape galaxies than the ones we saw before. Okay, quiz time for you. Which answer is right? I just showed you 3 different top 10 outliers from exactly the same data set. Which one was right? What? They're all right. Great answer. I like that answer. I don't know. Yeah, so they all are giving you a different taste of something that's anomalous within your data set. And without further knowledge, you can't objectively say which one's right, but they may all be telling you different interesting things about your data set. This can be a little frustrating for those of us who like to be able to quantify performance, and you want to be able to say, I found 90% of the outliers. You can't actually say that. But what you can do is take what you've learned from maybe multiple algorithms and take that the next step to which ones am I going to follow up on? Which ones show problems in my data set? Which ones do I need to fix? And so on. So finally, difficult to model events. I actually think this is the most interesting category, but that's probably just my bias. Again, we're building a model of normality, but in this case, we're deliberately creating an impoverished model, a simplified model, and then saying, what properties of the objects do I fail to model with my simple model? So probably many of you are familiar with principal component analysis or singular value decomposition, where you take your data, which is always two-dimensional in the examples, and you draw a line that says, this is the direction of maximum variability within my data set. And that characterizes the spread of the data if you can only say one thing about it. And if you can say 2 things about it, you pick this orthogonal direction, and then you have complete characterization of this two-dimensional data with 2 vectors. Then what you do, let's say you roll back and you only have 1 dimension, this black line. You project every point onto that one single black line, and whatever that distance is tells you how anomalous the point is, right? So it's pretty straightforward, at least in 2 dimensions. When it gets more complex, that's when it gets interesting, and I will show you that in a bit. Another common way to do this is with deep learning, or in this case, specifically an autoencoder or replicator network. So you take all of your data. It's a mushroom. Don't ask me why. You take your data, you flow it into a neural network, into this compressed representation, which you can kind of think of like compressing two-dimensional data into one. You're going 4 dimensions to 2. Then you try to reconstruct it. You've necessarily thrown away a bunch of information here. So this reconstruction is going to be missing something. Here it's like missing the subtle shadow and other subtle details of the mushroom. But whatever is missing is what was, in theory, interesting about that object. And if there's a lot missing, then it's probably an interesting outlier. So let's see an example of that. I applied singular value decomposition to the data set, and we get, wow, all sorts of weird things. In fact, this is the first time we're seeing what's probably a blended object popping out because it's not, centered in the frame. I don't know what that is. Maybe it's just extremely, extremely large because these all have the same size. And there's actually one of those streaks here. So very strange things that could not be represented in this compressed model that was built. Those are the methods that I wanted to run you through real fast. But I don't want to stop there. And this is an important point I hope you'll actually walk away with is you can't stop here. Again, like what does it mean? I don't know what these are. How can I use them? And so I argue that there's a necessary next step of actually providing some kind of explanation for the anomalies. Ideally, each algorithm, as it operates, can tell you why it picked something, not just look at it. So I have this quote here about searches for unexpected behavior will not be completely automated because ultimately you require human judgment to look at it. Even just deciding is something an artifact in the data or is it scientifically interesting? I get this question all the time. Can your algorithm tell me which ones are the interesting ones? No, it can't. That's where you come in. This will never take your job. So we still need humans, and we still need interpretation. We need to know, first of all, from the algorithm, why was this item chosen? And secondly, how does it compare to everything else in the data set? This is a hot area of research in machine learning. It is not solved. Advances at any form at this stage would be valuable for lots of people. And then, what next action are you going to take? Are you going to try to observe it? Maybe you have observations at a different wavelength or something like that that can tell you more about this object. Or maybe follow up later in time and see, has it changed? Or is there something persistently strange going on? These are essential steps. And I'm going to show you a couple examples of trying to help with that process from machine learning. So if we go back to, again, this let's build a model of normality that's compressed and then try to reconstruct something. This is a galaxy from the Dark Energy Survey data set, not Sloan, where something weird popped out when we did that. This object, you can see that it's blue, for one thing, and it's a very narrow point. What is it? The algorithm we used here is actually able to tell us, we observed at 4 different bands, green, red, or G, R, I, and Z, I should say. These are wideband observations. Here it can say, hey, my model told me I was expecting this across those 4 bands, but here's what I actually saw. So wherever there's a big gap, that is your explanation for why the algorithm picked it. And in this case, it is saying that the red intensity is it's lower in latitude, so it's much, much brighter than it should be. You will observe this is blue, not red. That is because we mapped this band to red, this one to green, and this one to blue. So if you map it through that in your head, you'll see why. It points out exactly this thing is much, much redder than it should be, which shows up as blue in the RGB. But at least now we know why the algorithm picked it. A second example is we looked at data from the Green Bank telescope of the Kepler field itself. So there was a discussion earlier about Kepler finding all these planets. We'd like to see, are there signals coming from the planet? And this is related to breakthrough listen as well. So if you look at everything in the Kepler field and detect radio pulse detections that have a high SNR around frequency range 1420, which is the hydrogen line, what you're seeing here again is a time versus frequency plot. And our algorithm pulled out this observation, which is obviously not consistent as a function of time, but it's pretty narrowly focused around 1420 with some modulation, which is interesting. The algorithm was able to tell us why it was interesting because it had mostly seen things that were a consistent straight line across at that frequency in the past. So it said anything red here is higher than it should have been, brighter. Anything blue is lower or darker than it should have been. So it's highlighting that frequency structure that is present within this observation. And as a second example, it highlighted this, which is actually very strange. As time goes on, increases in frequency. So that's weird. And it exactly tells us why it picked it. Yes, it is very bright here, and there's nothing horizontal that should have been there according to the model. Now, these may seem very simple. Like, you could look at that as a human and say, yeah, I can see where there's bright stuff. But notice it's not just highlighting bright stuff, it's highlighting bright, unexpected stuff. And if you've only looked at a couple of these, that's trivial. But if you're trying to look at a million of them, it's not. You won't remember the first 9,900,000 that you saw. So it's very helpful to have tools that can generate explanations along with the anomalies. So finally, here are the ideas I hope you can take away from what I've shared. That anomaly or outlier they're context dependent. It is not something we can just go and look for. If it were, we would already have supervised methods out there finding them for us. And secondly, there are these different types of anomalies, but both do help contribute to science. We don't just want to focus on one or the other. Third, we have at least three approaches to finding different kinds of anomalies. And you're welcome to try out any of these. There's publicly available open source software for them. And then after finding the anomalies, explanations are vital for actually turning that into scientifically valuable discoveries. Here are a couple of, you'll have these slides, as has been noted, a couple of great surveys of methods that go far deeper than I could today. This one is extremely good. This is a little bit earlier, but has a slightly different sampling of methods. And here is an open source Python-based library anyone can use to apply exactly the methods that I talked about today and many, many more. So I encourage you to try this out and have fun with that. All right, I will take questions.